Welcome, everyone. We are talking about addiction and trauma today. My name is Evelina Horovic. I work with Canadian Mental Health Association as a mental health educator, and myself and Cynthia have partnered to present this webinar today to all of you. And it is being recorded, so we will also post it and share it on social media for, I know Cmha maybe House of Self-Esteem as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so please share it with your friends if you find the information and relevant. So Cynthia, so I
Yes.
introduced you, but can you give a little background about yourself real quick?
Oh, sure. My name is Cynthia Maroon, and I'm the family community caseworker here at the House of Self-Esteem. I've been working in the field of addiction and trauma for the last 19 years, and it's something near and dear to my heart. I feel very passionate about being there for people who are impacted by substance use, both those with lived experience and those who are loving and supporting people that have substance abuse issues, which is something we're going to get into tomorrow a lot about. So I'm looking forward to that as well.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started.
So what we want to do with you today is go over some of the following things. We want to talk a little bit about having a better or deeper understanding of addiction and trauma. I want to share just kind of my understanding and experience with it from my perspective. I also want to kind of build a bridge for everybody today on, why does substance use become attractive to somebody who has a history of trauma? What is the connection there between those two things? And then I want to introduce an analogy of spirals and how we can use spirals as a way to look at the impact of addiction and trauma, but also how we can use the spiral to look at, recovery, healing, and growth as well. I do want to address the issue of the impact of people who have lived experience with addiction and trauma and how COVID is impacting their life experience. So I want to say to everybody that's participating today, I'd like you to think about the way you feel that if you're a professional, what are people saying to you in regards to the impact they feel they're having due to COVID? And if you are someone with lived experience, whether even if you're a family member watching the webinar today, or you're somebody that has a substance abuse issue yourself, I want you to think, how do you feel impacted, by the COVID experience? And just start thinking about that, because when we get to it, I'd really love to hear from all of you. And then Evelina and I are going to talk about ways to get help and what's available in our community and what's available online. And we're going to take a question and answer period. And then what I'd like to do is conclude our time together with a very brief and very simple self-compassion practice that you can implement into your life right away. Even if you're a professional, we could all use it, right? Good self-care.
Yes, absolutely.
So, yeah. Okay, so I'm probably going to spend the most time on this slide myself, because there's a lot of information here, and there's a lot of important information here that I want to share with everybody that's in attendance today, and for those that are going to see this video ongoing. So we're going to start with what we have in bold here. It's just a sentence and just a snapshot of addiction in a nutshell. And I know that there are lots of different definitions in the way people spin perspectives on what is addiction. But I really like this sentence because I feel that it really just gets to the core of it. So I'm going to read it and then I want to break it down. Number one, it says addiction is a chronic, often relapsing brain disease that causes compulsive seeking and use despite harmful consequences. So when we're talking about addiction as being chronic, what we're saying here is that addiction is long-term, that it's not something that happens and resolves itself within a week and then everything's back to normal. That's something that we would call acute or short-term, but addiction is something that is chronic. Now, a lot of things, health issues that are chronic, although they may not be curable per se, they are treatable. And that's important to keep in mind when you're thinking about addiction this way. The other thing is that when it says it's often a relapsed brain disease, we get into this discussion sometimes about, is it a disease? Is it not a disease? And what I like to say is, you have the freedom to believe what you want, the solutions, the interventions can be applied regardless of what you believe. So instead of getting into this discussion about is it a disease, not a disease, I will just share with you that from my perspective, that I do consider it as a disease. And the reason for that is because for me, diseases are something that happen when we have organs in our body that are not working properly. So if I have diabetes, for example, then what that would mean is that my pancreas isn't producing maybe enough insulin. And because of that, it's not working properly. And I get this diagnosis, and it's not curable, but it is treatable. So the brain is also an organ, and we do know that substances impact brain tissue, and it also impacts brain function. And it manipulates survival circuitry that we have. And just to put it very simply, without getting too sciencey, I guess, is just that um, the the way that it impacts the brain is it kind of uses that survival circuitry to make the person feel that the substance use is essential for their survival, and it almost tricks the brain, like, oh, this substance, because of the reaction you get when you ingest the substance, this is essential for your survival. This is essential above food. This is essential above your relationships. This is essential above affection or hygiene. This is essential above your safety. This is how it manipulates that organ. And when you don't acknowledge that, you're left, I feel, with a lot of shame, because then what people tend to do is chalk it up to a personality issue, a willpower issue, a not enough motivation issue, a love issue. You must not love this person if you're continuing to use when you know that they don't want to be with you if you're using. So they start making it all about that, which can be very shame inducing. And so I think it's critical that we understand that there are invisible physiological things that are occurring that are influencing our decision making. The other piece where we talk about the compulsive seeking and use, this is attached to that, manipulation of the survival circuitry of the brain despite harmful consequences. Addiction is not rational. And this is why we need change behavior when we're trying to address it, as opposed to just thinking our way out of it. Okay. Although my experience has been with chemical dependency, specifically like alcohol and drugs, I just wanted to acknowledge that those aren't the only ways addiction can flourish in a person's life. There is gambling addiction, sex addiction, shopping addiction, food addiction. There's all different types, and dependency on substances is just one of them. You'll see here the bottom half. Evelina, if you want to chime in at any point, please just if you want to go back to the other slide for a minute. But if you wanted to chime in at any point, Evelina, please feel free. I wanted to go through this little bullet list that I have with you. And the reason I want to do that is because it was very important to me today to highlight that the addiction and trauma experience, but addiction specifically, is an extremely individual experience, and that we cannot paint everybody that has an addiction with the same brush. And why can we not do that? Because of the things that I've listed here. And this is what I want to go through. So whether you are taking these points of consideration into effect because you yourself are a professional and you yourself are looking to find ways to help the person that you're working with, or if you're somebody that has lived experience and you're trying to understand yourself better and your relationship with substances better, this is why I've kind of created this list. So both to as a help for you, but also to highlight the point that addiction is a very individual experience, and we really have to work at not comparing one person to another. And we have to look at the person for who they are themselves in the way it's impacting their life specifically, and kind of go from there. So why? Because there's the predisposition is different for everybody. You know, some people are more predisposed to developing an addiction than other people. This may include genetic factors or maybe even family history, where you're growing up in a family where addiction is present. And there are some families where they don't really see the active drug use, but they feel the effects. They feel the distance. They feel the conflict. They feel the stress, you know. And then there are other families where, you know, just on the other end of the spectrum, that where it's very obvious that drug use is part of the family culture. And sometimes when kids even get to preteen age or something like that, they're not quite at an age where they could drink or something like that, it's perceived as a rite of passage to use substances early with the family, and even engage in addictive behavior with the family. You know, that's our culture, and this is, if you belong, this is what we do here, right? So you can begin to understand how it might be so difficult for somebody to break free from that, because sometimes creating change means changing relationships or changing family. And if a person is afraid to lose that or to be alone, sometimes they will choose addiction just to stay connected. The way addiction is lived out in an individual's life varies, and it's different. You know, the way addiction develops, their exposure to it, the opportunity, the availability of it, whether they use daily, whether they're binging, whether they're using in isolation, whether they're using to connect with others. It's different for everybody. And so what I find happens with people that are developing a problematic relationship with substances is they're very quick to compare. They're very quick to compare themselves. And they're like, I go to work every day, you know, I go to work, I only use on the weekend. Yeah, I'm having some problems at work. Yeah, I've got disciplined because I keep calling in sick on a Monday. But for the most part, I go to work every week and I provide for my family, and there's always food on the table. And then you have somebody else that is drinking every day, suffering housing instability, is going from one place to another, maybe in and out of the hospital. And you look at that person and you're like, you know, obviously I'm not that bad because I'm not like this person. But what you need to realize is that this person is having employment issues due to substance use, and you're having employment issues due to substance use. So even though your pattern of using is very different, there are some consequences that are still similar. And I encourage people to compare the feelings as opposed to the details of using career. Instead of comparing with people how they use, what they do to get what they want to use. Instead of comparing that, compare the feelings, because that's where you're really going to find where you have things in common. Also, people use different substances. And not only that, but they use them for different reasons. So just because you use a stimulant and another person uses a stimulant doesn't mean that you guys are using it for the same reason. So again, we're highlighting the individuality of the experience. Some people are attracted to depressants, you know, if they're usually full of anxiety and depressants relax them, you know, and we're going to get into the connection between addiction and trauma in a bit, but, you know, it's different for everybody. And just because someone has an addiction doesn't mean they'll grab any substance. You know, some people, they have the substances they like to use, and if they don't have it, they're miserable. They don't necessarily use other things. And some people do. The second last thing that I have here is the consequences of using substances. Those are different. Sometimes you'll have things in common with people. So for example, we both have legal issues, but for me, it was because I got angry, I lost my temper, and now I have domestic violence charges, where this person is like, I was going to get what I wanted and I got caught, and now I have drug possession charges. So we both have legal issues, but the reasons why we have these legal issues are very, very different. So the impact of substance use issues can range from having physical health issues to emotional issues, social and relationship issues, spiritual issues. It can disrupt your relationship with a higher power, mental health issues, and like I mentioned already, legal issues. And lastly, the healing path that a person takes to overcome addiction is just as individual as the addiction experience. And sometimes when we don't work in the field, or we're the family member just trying to help, we have this idea that they have to do this thing, this one particular thing, and if they don't do it, nothing's going to work and nothing's going to help. And sometimes people that have the addiction, they also feel that way, that they have to do this one particular thing or walk this one particular path, or else nothing's going to help. So the example I like to use is like residential treatment. Many people, even professionals, that necessarily don't specialize or work in the field of addiction, will think this person has to go to residential treatment or they're not going to get well. And I do understand the logic behind that. And I do understand the rationale and the concern. There's a lot of worry around loving somebody and caring for somebody that has an addiction and being out there, and there's trust issues and all of that. And I get that. But sometimes residential isn't a good fit. And that's just a reality. And you have to know the needs of that person. And there's a lot that needs to be taken into consideration. And that's why we have assessment referral centers, to help with that process and to make sure that the person is being matched with the best form of treatment in order to get the best possible outcome. The other thing I want to say about this before we move on is just, if you're somebody that has a substance abuse issue yourself, and you're listening to this, in the spirit of not waiting for the perfect moment to get well, what I have found over time is that the perfect moment usually doesn't happen. We wait and wait for all the situations in our life to just become so that we can, take the step we think we need to make. But what usually happens is something else always comes up. So instead of waiting for that perfect moment, what I would encourage you to do is just start getting curious about your relationship with substances. Instead of being judgmental of yourself, get curious, look at this list, ask yourself these questions. What was my family history? Maybe I need to draw a little map on a piece of paper and look at how substances have flourished in my family. Get curious about what your exposure was, or the opportunity or the availability of substances as you were growing up. Look at your pattern of using, and is there a theme there to that would give you a deeper appreciation of why you keep doing these things despite harmful consequences. Get curious about why you reach for certain substances. What need do you think that is filling? And if you're like, that sounds like a lot, I don't know if I can do this, on my own. You don't have to. You can call somebody, for example, at the House of Soccer scene, and say, I need to talk to somebody. And we'll do this with you. We will help you through it. And it doesn't mean that just because you're talking to somebody that you have to stop using. And that belief that if I go and I tell somebody about my problem, it means that I better do something about it, or else it's going to look bad, or I'm going to feel bad. We have to break away from that and just focus on, do I have a place where I feel safe enough to be honest? That should probably be your first question. Because if you can find a place where you feel like you can be open and you can be honest, then we can start to see what's really going on, and we can really start to help, right? We can't help you with things we don't know you're struggling with. So just to consider taking steps, even if your situations aren't perfect. And, tomorrow we're going to talk more to the family about these ideas, but from the family and friends perspective. So if you are a family member attending today, please consider tuning in, tomorrow, because that is really for you. So I'll just let Evelina.
Thank you. Thank you,
You're
Cynthia. I just wanted to mention that there was a message in the chat, and we encourage anyone, if you have a question, better to ask it during the time. So Mandy asks, I'm wondering if there's a way for anyone to know when people get help for addiction/mental health.
Okay, so I'm wondering if there is a way for anyone to know when people get help. I'm just not sure. Okay, wait, she's just adding to it.
Yep.
I know that I recently heard that a youth was struggling and that their family member was telling them, not to seek help through the hospital, and that it will go on their record and affect future job opportunities. This is a great
Great question.
point. I am so glad that you brought this up, because this is the reality. Addiction is so stigmatized. Addiction is so judged in our community, in our culture, that in other cultures as well. But there is so much stigma and judgment around it that people are not getting help for these type of fears. Fear that it's going to go on a record, that your potential employer is going to find out through the hospital somehow, and that it's going to affect your future opportunities. What I would probably say in that situation is, it's better to, even if you know this person probably would benefit from an intervention of the services that the hospital provides, if there's a fear there, then it's better to contact another organization that you feel safer going to, and at least starting the discussion and starting to create a plan and getting some interventions, than deciding you're not going somewhere at all. So maybe the help needs to start even anonymously online. We're going to talk about some online resources where you can start to have these discussions and to get help, like places like Big White Wall and stuff like that. So there are ways to confidentially start having these discussions if you're afraid of your reputation being jeopardized by admitting or addressing the fact that you have a problem with using.
So, and also Cynthia, in terms of the like medical records and employers being able to access those,
Mm-hmm.
I, I don't know too much about how that would happen exactly. I think
No.
that I don't think there's that there's a possibility of someone. I mean, that's a confidential like medical record. Oftentimes, if you
Yeah.
go to hospital for any reason, like they will close that after you're gone. They will close the file and basically discharge you out of hospital for whatever reason, and that gets stored somewhere in the hospital. It's not like unless the primary health provider or GP needs to know and it needs to have something faxed to the primary provider, then maybe. But I think there's a huge misconception that for some reason files or medical files can be accessed by employers. Like there are, human rights rules and things like that. And also any sort of access to medical records or any records have to go through privacy and there has to be a request. And usually the person that is notified of a certain request and things like that. So
Yeah.
like someone could just request it and right away receive that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's yeah, someone mentioned or maybe I work in HR and I've never heard of us being able to get information. Yeah, that like that, nor have we tried. Everything is super confidential, even for sick leaves. They do not give us any information. Exactly. So
Mm-hmm.
So the only, in terms of reputation, I think Cynthia, that you're mentioning, if you're in a community where you have gone to seek treatment for addiction, you may
Mm-hmm.
see people in that community that may have known that you went to seek treatment, right? But even in treatment or at hospital, there is confidentiality rules as well. So it's not like that staff can go and say, "Oh, this person, you know who this person was that was seeking treatment." That's not allowed either.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of confidentiality protecting individuals seeking treatment. Just wanted to mention.
Good point.
Hopefully, answer your question, Mandy. I'm going to move on, if that's all right, to
Mm-hmm.
the next section, which is just some statistics about addictions. Um, so according to the World Health Organization, like we talk about, how common, so there's just some numbers here, but the bottom one is actually a bit surprising to me because like there's about 100,000 people in Ontario who are experiencing problems as a result of gambling.
Mm-hmm.
That was quite high. And
Mm-hmm.
6.3 million people worldwide have alcohol use disorders. So that would be something that could be actually diagnosed as an alcohol use disorder through screening.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
at least 15.3 million people worldwide have drug use disorders of some sorts. One third of the world's population over the age 15 smoke tobacco. And I wonder, this doesn't include vaping, so I think that would be even higher if we also
Mm-hmm.
gambling is an activity that is growing in popularity. So in 2004, roughly Canadians, about $2.4 billion was spent on gambling. on some form of government-run gambling activity. So, so this is also included, drug addiction and gambling addiction, and then like we could talk about even gaming addiction, all of those, things that we look at, right? So when you think about like why some things happen and the connection between, and Cynthia's going to get into this a bit more, but I want to talk a little bit about trauma because it's important to note, and this is called addiction and trauma, but what is trauma and what do we mean by trauma exactly? So I love this quote by Tara Brach. It says, trauma is when we have encountered an out of control, frightening experience that has disconnected us from all sense of resourcefulness or safety or coping or love.
Mm-hmm.
That could mean a lot of different things, right?
So,
oh, sorry, I clicked a button and I muted you by accident.
okay, can you hear me?
Sorry.
she's like, I know you're going to say something, mute.
No, I just clicked the wrong.
I just wanted to say, like, yeah, you're right. I love this, is a beautiful definition. I really do like it. But a couple of things I want to highlight, that even though there's different types of definitions surrounding trauma, just like there is with addiction, I feel like some of the key things that common threads between these definitions is, number one, is understanding that the experience is overwhelming in some way. It's overwhelming, so much so to the point that it overrides normal coping. And that's what you're talking about when you read, you disconnect from all sense of resourcefulness, is you lose that ability to use whatever normal coping you have when things aren't as overwhelming. The other thing that I have found in just the years of working with people impacted by trauma is that oftentimes the experiences were unpredicted, they were sudden when they happened. So even if you are in an abusive relationship and you know that sometimes things get abusive in your relationship, you might not be able to predict when that happens. So there's still that element of unpredictability and this suddenness. And the other piece is, when you feel like you can't use your normal coping, there is a stuck feeling that occurs, that you feel like there's no way out of this. So if you don't know how it's going to end, you don't know how you're going to get out of it. So that's that unpredictability, the overwhelming, the suddenness, and I'm feeling trapped and like there's no way out. And that just kind of, that experience, burns into our mind and our body and our nervous system. And we start having all of these other signs and symptoms that we're going to get into. But before we just move on, I wanted to highlight two things about trauma. I wanted to kind of just bring our attention and make us aware of two types of suffering that, we have in our experience as people. And the one type is natural suffering. And this is the kind of suffering that occurs to everybody, that everybody could be subjected to. So we all have bodies. So we all may get ill at some point. And that illness may create suffering. What kind of illness varies, whether it's short-term or chronic, like we talked about before, it depends. But we all have bodies and they could fall ill, is the first thing. That would be natural suffering. The other natural suffering would be like, we all at some point will experience loss through death. And whether that be a friend or a family member or a pet, that is part of the life experience. Grief is a part of the suffering that we go through as people and learning to deal with that. So when we experience things that are natural to the world, I believe that there is a space in our mind where we, even though at times we may take it personal, there's this other part of ourselves that knows that this is part of the human experience, and we can work through that, and we have that deep understanding. But there's this other type of suffering in the world that, I call created suffering. And this is the kind of suffering that people decide to bring to one another. And when you have a history of trauma, and a lot of the people that I have worked with over the years, their trauma has been created suffering. Not only that, but the suffering that was placed on them was by people who were supposed to love and protect them. That kind of suffering, I feel, has a much deeper and long-term impact on somebody. because now I have had an experience where love and care has been tainted with pain and suffering, like they're supposed to somehow go together. And when I think about getting into relationships, whether it be a working relationship with a professional who is saying that they're sincere and they care and they want to help, that may be a trigger to me. Uh-oh, you want to help me? You care about me? You care what happens to me? I think I might want to push that away a little bit, because in my mind, I have associated risk and pain and suffering with people who care about me. And, if you're somebody that is, has a history of trauma with created suffering, and you're trying to build relationships, not professional, but even romantic, it can be the same thing. And people can actually get into patterns where they deliberately create conflict or some type of strain in the relationship because they're not used to being treated well. And so now I'm going to create this conflict so that I can put you in the role I need you to be in, so that I know who I am. Because I really don't know who I am when I'm loved and I'm not manipulated and I'm not betrayed. And it feels weird and it feels uncomfortable. That's normal for people that have been through that type of trauma. And that's important to understand.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That's
Welcome.
very complimentary to everything we're kind of talking about, and that's part of these quotes, right? So when we talk about impact, it's felt throughout an individual's life in areas of function that might seem far removed from trauma, just like you're talking about relationship with new people you meet in your life, and then there's this almost reenacting, or like the same, some individuals say, how do I get into these same relationships all the time, or why do these same kind of experiences happen in those relationships? It's sometimes related to trauma and how we how we react, how we respond to certain things. And I think you highlighted a lot about how out of kind of we lose our autonomy in those traumatic created suffering experiences. So the effects of that do actually have physiological changes in the brain, increase in physical and mental stress, compromised immune system, and we'll talk about ACE scores in a second, but not just in terms of chronic diseases and things like that, but you also may have, the relationship decreased trust, attachment difficulties, or conflictual relationships, that hyper arousal, hyper-vigilance. When you're hearing loud sounds, you may get quickly frightened.
Jumpy. Mm-hmm.
Jumpy. It could be anything, right? You're always in that fight, flight, freeze mode sometimes.
If you could just stay here for a second, Evelina,
Absolutely.
and if
Yeah.
you look at this image here of physical problems, emotional, social, learning problems, other problems, and you start looking at this, if you have a history of trauma and you're experiencing this, you can begin to understand that if you don't have education around what trauma is, how it impacts a person, how you can transform it and begin to take your power back. If you don't expose yourself to help and you're just living with this, you can begin to see how it might be very shame inducing, how you might start asking yourself, what is wrong with me? I can't tell you how many times I hear my clients say, I just want to be normal. I just want to be normal, whatever that means for them. And you're having all of these issues. And so, when you're thinking about somebody who has an addiction, a lot of times that's all people see. They see the impact of the addiction. They see the broken promises. They see the hospital visits. They see the intoxication. They see people not showing up, and not following through. They see all of these things, but they don't necessarily see the trauma. And so if you love somebody or you're trying to help somebody, you should be thinking, could there be other undercurrents? Because at the end of the day, addiction is really a symptom of a bigger issue, right? And we need to look at that so that we can really get down to what's really underneath all that behavior and do the work that needs to happen so that that behavior can change.
And that's why when we talk about like the window of tolerance, and I know this is a very
Whoa.
it's like, whoa, think about when we're stressed, right? hyperarousal, we all have this, right? So imagine a person, basically what I want to talk about with this slide, imagine a person who's always been in a heightened state. So when you're not feeling your best, are you making the best choices at that time? Do you feel like you're capable of doing that in that moment, or are you sort of reacting to whatever you need to react to because you're in fight, flight, freeze mode, and you need to survive? So this basically just talks about how the nervous system, there has to be a certain amount of level of arousal for everyone, like during your day, but if there's too much or too little, that's when we get into some difficulty, right? So it's hard for an individual who's experienced trauma to regulate that arousal because we are coming from their parasympathetic nervous system has completely been affected. Their HPA axis, their pituitary gland, their adrenals, you know, uh, everything regarding how they perceive the world now has changed because of those traumatic incidents, whether it's one or whether it's several, where they believe that the world is not safe and we can't trust things that we see. Where another individual may look at something very differently than that individual who has experienced that trauma. So it's very important that this is a physiological change and that hyperarousal. That's why maybe that person doesn't show up, or that's why they're using substances. So we have to keep those things in mind. And when it comes to when we talk about the prefrontal cortex, basically the upstairs brain, the newer part of our brain through evolution, this is where we have body awareness, ability to attune to others' emotions, or to others in general, to regulate our emotions, and balance them. This is where we can like let ourselves know, hey, everything's okay. We can calm our fears. Ability to respond and pause before we act. Like we're not coming from a place of well, we talk about this a lot, right? In addiction, it's just like try to respond, then react, because reaction is from that hyperarousal stress state, fight, flight, or freeze. And to respond, that we do need to use our prefrontal cortex to take a moment to do that. And also for insight, reflection, and to think before we act, right? Ability to feel empathy, capable of having a sense of morality, fairness, and common good, and being ability to be intuitive, right, with others. So if a person is working from the part of their brain, the amygdala, and also that changes the size of the amygdala oftentimes. So what an individual perceives as a threat or scary, or something to be afraid of, is different for an individual who's experienced trauma, right? It's similar with anxiety, right? An individual may perceive things as something to be scared of, where it might not have any actual threat, or an individual may be triggered by something, and the word triggered because it brings them back to a memory, and that memory has feelings, emotions, and senses around those things, right? So trauma is all the entire body, the whole parasympathetic nervous system, right? And what do we know about survival? And thank goodness we have this part of us to help us survive. And when we need to run or fight or flee or do whatever we need to do, thank goodness that we have that survival mechanism. But for an individual who's experienced trauma, that mechanism is not working properly because the associations between things that are safe and things that are dangerous has changed because of those experiences, and oftentimes that's in early childhood that occurs. So trauma trumps logic every single time.
I just wanted to add something, Evelina, in regards to this. If you look at this list, body awareness, tuning into others, balancing emotions, if you're somebody working with somebody that has a history of addiction and trauma, and you're just a helper, maybe you're not a professional, maybe you're just somebody who's trying to have a positive influence in their life, or you care about them. And even if you are a professional, but you don't specialize in working with addiction and trauma, let's say, okay, some of these things may be present, and because they're invisible to you and to the person, they're happening physiologically in your body. There's structural ways that the brain is being impacted by trauma and drug use. Sometimes we can personalize it as, what's wrong with this person? This person knows I don't like it when they're, losing their temper. This person knows that, they're so drama, saying that they're having anxiety all the time, and they start to judge and induce shame and just out of frustration and not knowing what to do or how to help. And they start making it almost like this person is choosing to do this or that. And I know that there is a very fine line between what is the influence from the addiction and trauma and where the person needs to begin as far as what they do have within their control. I do recognize that and I understand that. But at the same time, if you don't know for sure which is addiction and trauma induced and which is just real behavior, difficult behavior, or somebody being offensive or whatever, if you don't know, I would recommend that you just be kind and assume that maybe it's addiction and trauma. Because at least by assuming that, we can get to a more compassionate and non-judgmental place that is actually helpful to the other person, as opposed to thinking that it's just a personal thing and they're choosing to do this and that.
And along with that, Cynthia, thank you, is that it takes, when we talk about attachment and trauma, it takes a long time to build trust. So just like Cynthia was mentioning about relationships, creating some sort of, maybe even, let's say, use the term, and subconsciously, or because of all these things, chaos in those relationships or in their environment, because that's what they're used to. And it's like, that's who I am. If I'm around chaos, that's where I'm almost comfortable, because I'm familiar with it.
Yes.
That's like, oh, you're going to treat me with compassion, even though I'm behaving this way, even though it's like you're rewiring, you're relearning
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
someone treats you with compassion.
And if you're the one with the lived experience with addiction, this applies to you too.
Yeah.
If you're frustrated with yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I behaving that way? Why do I react this way? I would say choose a compassionate mindset and say, maybe there's some things that are at play here that I can't see or that I don't understand. And then go from there.
Absolutely. Well, this kind of what we see and what's behind the iceberg, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
behind that challenging behavior, let's say, right? It's much more underneath than above.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the connection between addiction and trauma, if you had a history of trauma, we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences in a moment, but if you had issues that had occurred prior to the development of your addiction, and then you start growing up and you start getting exposed to substances, you will very quickly find out that ingesting some type of mood altering chemical can do the work in your body that you struggle to do for yourself. And that might be helping you feel calm, helping fade memories or making the memories of trauma feel more distant, help you sleep. So you may use to the point that you prevent yourself from having dream time because you're afraid to have nightmares. Substances can make you feel courageous. Some substances, especially if you feel very afraid to leave the home, if you have a lot of trauma triggers, from going out in public, worrying about people being behind you, loud noise of traffic, and being in the community. So sometimes using can make me feel courageous. Why? So that I can go grocery shopping, so that I could go to a doctor's appointment, so that I can go visit somebody I love. I'm not doing it because I'm trying to be deviant. I'm not doing it because I'm trying to ruin my life. I'm doing it because I'm actually trying to be functional in a backwards kind of way. It's just the nature of addiction doesn't allow you to stay that way. It doesn't allow you to stay functional. It just progressively gets more problematic because of the nature of the way substances work. But the intention behind your original relationship with using is usually not one to bring harm or hurt to yourself or others. It's usually about coping and feeling good and trying to feel like you belong in the world somewhere. And so, just as much as it can fuel feelings of connection with people, if you struggle with feeling connected or with trust, like we had talked about, it can also help create distance if you don't feel safe around others. So some people latch on to that deviant criminal lifestyle because, man, it keeps people away. and that's what I need. So this is not a completely inclusive list for every scenario. It's just to start a discussion and to gain an acknowledgement that there definitely is a link between, having a history of trauma and inviting substances to be a regular part of your life to cope. And if you didn't, there are people that grow up in wonderful family systems that have wonderful supportive parents and siblings, and they develop an addiction to a substance. And it may not have to do with their family, but more about an experience that happened outside of the family. Or maybe it could be something like bullying, all through school. There's lots of reasons, but what I can tell you is even if you don't identify as having trauma prior to your addiction, even though it's extremely common that had occurred for people who have substance use issues, definitely having an addiction, because of the way it manipulates the circuitry of the mind and demands to be primary, it demands to be number one above all things, including your safety, you often can find yourself gaining trauma from your substance use through witnessing things, being in places that get raided, being arrested and feeling traumatized by the experience of incarceration, being assaulted, having your children apprehended. All of these things can result in trauma. And now it's either you've had trauma compounded by issues and trauma and the issues that come along with that, and then addiction, which compounds that, and then the issues that come along with that, and then you've got both. Or you can have this addiction and get this exposure to all of these other situations, and then you've got trauma compounded on top of that. So either way, it's just all around feels overwhelming and complicated, and this is why help is so important.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about help and things like that, but any place that like also has that lens where they look at is trauma informed of some sort, like it does consider that's I think an important part of it. And I think, Cynthia, that's what the House of Soccer students is, very trauma informed, right?
Mhm.
And it's always important to consider, because I
Mhm.
I don't think I've ever met an individual who has sought help who's not experienced some form of trauma or one way or another. And what I wanted to mention very quickly is what is traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another person. It doesn't matter what the event is. It doesn't matter what the event is, right? It doesn't
Mhm.
whether that's something that's maybe traumatic to you if you experience that. What matters is that individual's perception of that event and the meaning behind that event.
Yeah.
That's very important, and it's important to validate that individual. If they tell
Yeah.
you something has happened to them and you can tell that's like very, very, difficult experience, compassion, right? Validation. I believe you. That sounds like it was pretty rough, because I think a lot of individuals with addictions and trauma are dismissed.
Yeah.
Or the people stop bothering to listen. And, if those behaviors, if they're not changing their behaviors, which reinforces the feelings of being different, of being alone, of continuing into a path where that may be a bit more destructive or difficult
Mhm.
to manage. Right?
Or they say that happened this long ago, get over it already. They
Yeah,
don't understand that when it comes to trauma, time does not necessarily heal the impact of it.
and that's the difference that you talked about, the different types of suffering.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't tend to heal it. And if the person who has the history of trauma, how many people who have the history of trauma who know that they're still struggling with it, that say to me, I don't understand what I'm complaining about. This happened like 20 years ago. What is my problem? And they just self-blame, self-judge. And this is why I keep saying it is crucial to have self-compassion and non-judgment, either as the person with lived experience or the person helping the other person, because there's so much misinformation or misunderstanding about what these things are, that education around them is so important. And yeah, at House of Sophrosyne, this is part of what you learn when you come, even in some of our virtual programs that we have, virtual treatment, our residential treatment. we introduce you to the education that you need to really not just understand what trauma is, to understand what it looks like, and to understand how it impacts a person and how to handle the symptoms of it, whether it be the hypervigilance that we talked about, or the nightmares, the anxiety, the panic, the flashbacks, the triggers, all those kinds of things, so that you can start to feel empowered and you can start to feel like you can self-manage what you have going on with support. But yeah, that's a really good point that you definitely bring up. Perception is the key. That is it. And so I have come to say to the people that I work with, pain is pain. And when I talked about the comparing with addiction initially, in the first slide, and how that's not helpful to compare the details, is also not helpful to compare the details of the trauma. Again, I would encourage you to look at the feelings that are experienced when you've gone through something you identify as traumatic, as opposed to the detail. And the reason why is because I have met people numerous times that are in treatment, let's say residential treatment, and they come up to me and they say, I don't think I should be here. And I say, why? Well, I went through trauma, but it was this thing that happened when I was like 7, and it just happened one time. But that girl over there, she has been through trauma for years, and she had this happen and this happen and this happen and this happen. And my heart just goes out to her. And I just feel like I'm taking a bed away from somebody who probably needs it more than me. That breaks my heart, because what this person is not acknowledging is that pain is pain, and that they are minimizing the impact of their own trauma because it doesn't sound as bad as somebody else's. And that is not fair. Pain is pain. You are entitled to be impacted. And if that person talks to that other person and they just talk about feelings or thoughts about the self as a result of the trauma, they will see they're right on par with one another. But because people get lost in comparing in the details, it starts to kind of fuel this feeling of maybe I'm making a big deal of something that I shouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't even be here for help. Maybe they could be hard on themselves. They can call themselves a suck or a baby or weak because they're impacted by something that doesn't match what somebody else went through. So I cannot say it enough how important it is that you compare yourself to yourself. Where was I before? Where am I now? And you can use these spirals as a way to compare how you're doing. And I'm going to explain that to you very quickly. If you look at this, the slide here, I don't know if it's on the left for you guys or the right, but it's blue. If you can see that, it's the blue spiral, where the thread that's in the middle of this spiral, this is the addiction and the trauma. Okay, this is the thing that is within the person that they're dealing with. And the spiral motion is them moving throughout their life. And as they're moving through, it always comes back to substance use and trauma as they go through. And what usually happens without help and support is a person tends to go downward, because we understand that addiction is progressive and things don't tend to heal when you're in active addiction. Things actually tend to get worse oftentimes. So you have this spiraling that happens. And if you notice, that the spiral is usually wider at the top and begins to constrict as it gets to the bottom. And that is really speaks well to the impact of addiction and trauma, that it's extremely constricting. And from an addiction perspective, the constriction looks like I can do less and less in my life. I have to get closer and closer to my addiction in order to function. Right? So it's like, I can't have this nice, wide, expanded travel around these issues, because now it's gotten to the point where I feel like I can do less and less. And I've got to be really tightly wound around the addiction, the substances, or to protect my trauma. Because from a trauma perspective, trauma is all about avoidance. And it's not avoidance because you don't want to heal. It's avoidance because of the fear and the triggers and the distress and the uncomfortability and the desire to just make it one day to the next. But you find often with unaddressed trauma that too can lead to a constriction feeling because of the avoidance. I can't take a bus. I can't go in public. I can't meet this person. I can't, go to groups. I can't, and you start seeing how the constriction happens, which all leads to a crisis point or a turning point for somebody, where they cannot ignore the impact that this constriction is having in their life, and they're forced to look at it. A lot of people will call this a person's bottom. And I am not, a fan of saying that, people have to hit bottom. It's not really my approach. I know I'm not knocking it as other people's approaches. I'm just saying that it's not something that I often say and that I promote, because I feel that people that have a history of addiction have enough suffering, and I don't believe they need necessarily more suffering in order to change. I believe they need compassion, non-judgment, and safety in order to change, not more suffering. And so they have this like crisis point where they're taking a look at things, and this is where people will sometimes choose to go to withdrawal management for the first time, or call somewhere for help, or tell somebody the truth of what's going on and what they've been through, or go get an assessment, or decide that it's time for residential treatment because they've tried outpatient. Everybody is different, but they start looking at change because it's too painful to stay the same. Even though they're trying the best to function, it's just too painful. And the other thing just about the bottoms, a wise person once said to me, that's a person with lived experience, said, there's a bottom below the bottom, And just because a person hits bottom, and if they don't change or they relapse, some people say, well, they obviously didn't hit bottom. That's not true. Just because a person becomes afraid or doesn't follow through with their plans, it really doesn't mean that they don't want to change. And people are very quick to assume that that's what it means. I can not follow through with my appointment for counseling and still really want to change. I can have both at the same time. What's true is that not showing up isn't helpful, but it doesn't necessarily mean you don't want to change. Okay. And we have to think about the way that we live in a world that multiple truths can exist at the same time. A person with lived experience can really want to drink and can really not want to drink, all at the same time. And when you look at going up the spiral, it's like you look at the green here and you have this crisis point that just occurred. And you notice that the spiral, when we're going up it, there's that line again. But that line is not active addiction and trauma. What it is your history and your experience in the healing and transformation of what you've been through. So instead of it being your addiction, this line is your recovery. This line is the transformation of your traumatic experience, in the history of being someone who has survived and overcome a traumatic experience. And the spiral is about you moving through your life in recovery and expanding it up. So in the beginning, you notice that the spiral is really tightly wound around the bottom. And this is because you need to stay close to the things that are helping you change. And in 12-step fellowship, you'll often hear 90 meetings in 90 days. The idea is that in the beginning, people are vulnerable. It's very, very hard to break patterns. And you need a lot of support. And we want to encourage you to stay close and tightly around the things that are helping you get to that next level in your life. But as time goes on and you move up that spiral, you'll notice that the spiral begins to expand, and you're able to do more and more without having to hold so tightly to all of the treatment providers, or, you start to flourish and you start to grow and you start to expand up and you start to breathe again. A lot of people with trauma feel like they can't take a deep breath. That is super, super common. So even just the relationship that you have with your breath can change over time. And it's a very helpful thing, because good deep breathing sends a message to our body that we are not in fear. Constricted breathing, chest breathing, sends a message that we have something to worry about. So in all of these ways. So these are the spirals. I find that they're simple, and the way that you can use it as a tool for yourself is identify where you are. What spiral are you on? Are you on the addiction and trauma spiral? Are you on the recovering and healing spiral at this point in your journey? And not only that, but where do you fall within the rings of that spiral? And you can use this as a goal with goal setting, when you say to yourself, okay, you know what? I am on the recovering and healing spiral. I'm probably on the third ring up. Then you can ask yourself, what would have to happen in my life to get me to the next ring? Or if you're on the addiction and trauma, things are getting worse, for myself. Do I really want to continue to let this be unaddressed? If I was to go down even further in my addiction and trauma, what would that look like? And is that something I'm prepared to handle? Or should I start talking to somebody now? So these simple tools can be very, very helpful in just having a discussion with people that you love casually as a support, people you trust, or for a professional to use these to have a discussion with their client as well. So I asked you to think about the impact of COVID. So if you could, maybe put in the chat some of your thoughts or observations about, if you're a professional, what are your clients telling you about the impact on addiction and trauma due to the impact of COVID, or if you're someone with lived experience, how is COVID impacting you? I would love to hear from you. Some of the things that I have seen is because there's been a decrease in in-person meetings, it's fueling some of the feelings that I've listed here in the fourth bullet, which is restlessness, boredom, isolation, stress. Some people, in-person meetings are really, really important, having that, being in a physical space with other people for support, because maybe normally you're already very isolated. So not having those in-person meetings and seeing people the way you normally do has been really difficult. There has been an increase, I've noticed, in virtual support. I know for sure that that's what we've done here at the House of Sovereignty, but it doesn't mean that it's barrier free, because there are people that don't have the technology in order to participate, or they're not tech savvy, or they don't have access to a stable internet connection, or their phone is too old and they can't afford to upgrade, and they don't have any other, computer system. So it can be very challenging. So even though I know a lot of organizations, even outside of our own, are doing their best at making their programs accessible, sometimes it's falling short for a lot of people, and that's really, really, really hard. The other thing that I've seen is that there's been changes to the process of accessing treatment. I know that some places are not operating at full capacity because they are enforcing social distancing opportunities within the living environment. So wait lists that were long before are now even longer because of this reason. And so this is why I'm really stressing to think outside of just residential. I think residential treatment is very attractive to people because people want the peace of mind of being plucked out of their environment, and they want to be in somewhere where they feel safe, and that's a good want. But it's a problem if you think that help is impossible outside of that want. There is help and there is support. You just have to be open-minded and being willing to access it and try it on for size, and not to give up on yourself. If you talk to somebody and it doesn't feel right, that's fine. You don't have to like everybody that you talk to, but keep looking. Don't give up on yourself, because you're gonna find somebody that you're like, where have you been all my life? This is great. I love your style. I love the way you are. I feel like I can be honest with you. This feels like real work, and this is going to be helpful, right? So we have somebody that's just talking in the chat, so I'm just going to go to that for a minute. Someone is saying, I have lived experience in recovery, and I am so grateful for my supports. Otherwise, I don't know how I would have done during this time. So yeah, so if you can think of people that don't have a good support system, how difficult it would be for them to cope, and how attractive using might be to them in order just to cope with the isolation, the boredom, the restlessness, the stress, the employment issues, financial stress potentially, and so on and so forth. She also says, I am on the other side hearing a lot of overdoses happening with those who are struggling, which is heartbreaking. Yes, I agree. It is absolutely heartbreaking and traumatizing for many people that are experiencing these losses. And I'm finding in general, family and friends are feeling the weight of all of this. And now they're finding it hard to cope. And that's why when Evelina and I were having a discussion about doing this webinar, I said, there's a lot to talk about in regards to this issue and with family. And I think there's enough to have 2 days worth. And we can dedicate a whole day just to family. So that's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. And so I hope that, people find it helpful. And Evelina's thanking her for sharing that. What do you think, Evelina? What are you seeing?
Same thing, and I mean, today's, suicide prevention, and we're going to say,
Yeah.
that's why my virtual background, and also, when we talk about the difficulties, and not everybody is wrapped in supports. And I think a lot of uh, well-being and what promotes resiliency, adaptation, well-being to difficult situation and adversity is having, what someone mentioned in the chat, and we have been mentioning, is a community of people who can be, there, and who we can rely on, feel safe with, and feel empowered by. That's unfortunately, sometimes in society, that's a huge ask, because there's financial stressors, there's
Mhm.
the cultural aspects of an individual is that, or that individualistic mentality where you have to figure it out yourself. And we're talking about community, and we're talking about supports that, relying on one another, and that kind of goes against um, our cultural values. So I mean, that's just a little short thing, but I think it has brought people together, uh, but also it has also made a lot of individuals feel very lonely and isolated. So
Mhm.
this is a very individualistic experience.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think I'm gonna, yeah. So
Okay.
in terms of,
So,
yeah,
Evelina, before we move on to getting help, could I just address the ACE questionnaire very quickly? I know I'm being mindful of time, but
yeah,
we had mentioned
absolutely.
earlier that we were going to get to it. So I just wanted to follow up with that and just say to everybody, there's something called the ACE questionnaire, and anybody could Google this and go online and probably find a sample copy and be able to read the details of what this actually looks like. But here's why it's significant, because um, the ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And these experiences are things that people tend to go through earlier in life as children. And so if a person has gone through these adverse experiences like physical or emotional abuse or neglect or domestic violence, or a parent has been, incarcerated, let's say, for example, or a divorce, where they experience the fracture, in the family, that they did this study over 10 years to follow people, and they did this with I believe like 17,000 people were involved in this study over a period of time. And what they found is exactly what we were talking about earlier, which was that when people go through these type of traumatic adverse experiences as children, that time doesn't necessarily heal all things. And yeah, so we have this video that Evelina's bringing up here, but just that. And so some of the outcomes is that you may find that if you've had those experiences, that you're significantly at risk for developing a substance use issue, that you're, at risk of developing health issues, heart disease, diabetes, lung issues, those kinds of things. And also your schooling may suffer. You may have academic issues in school. And so it's really, really important not to minimize things that maybe even happened a long time ago. So even if you're like, I don't think I did go through some stuff, but I don't think it really impacted me. I think I'm over it. Well, if you have a substance use issue, I would say to you, I think it's time that maybe you get curious about it and you have a conversation with somebody you trust about it, just to see, really, has there been an impact? Like, get an outsider's perspective, get a fresh pair of eyes to kind of look at the situation instead of just keeping it all up in your mind alone by yourself.
Thank you. I
Do you want
just
to say
shared.
anything about the video? Yeah.
I would just recommend saving the video, or for later viewing. It's kind of a long video, and we don't have time to watch the whole video, but it's similar to what I mentioned earlier and Cynthia mentioned. Uh, it's very important, because whether what Nadine mentions in the TED Talk, whether you use coping such as smoking or use drug use or anything like that, just having those adverse childhood experiences in themselves are still correlated to negative health outcomes. So whether
Mm-hmm.
using substances or not using substances, it's important to note that that trauma or those adverse events in life really do have an effect on your immune system, on that HPA axis that I was talking about, on your perception of the world, on your attachment and trust, and feelings of safety, which will always have a negative outcome unless you seek help and treatment of some sort, right? So I also wanted to point that there's a lot of individuals that have experienced adverse childhood events and may not be uh, where we're talking about addiction. They might cope with it differently,
Yep.
or not be part of that. So that's important that they're to be aware of that. That there's a lot of people out there that experience trauma and may use different behaviors to try to cope with that.
Absolutely. Thanks for putting that in the chat. So if you haven't looked in the chat, there's a link there to that video that Evelina was talking about.
So in terms of getting help, it's important that we consider both formal and informal supports. So whether it's a family service agency, community mental health counselor, therapist, family doctor, community health center, religious spiritual leaders, or a church or a mosque, an EAP program at work, telephone helplines, hospitals, settlement agencies. It doesn't matter the modality or where you seek treatment or help. What matters is that you reach out and start somewhere, because as Cynthia mentioned, everyone is very individual. It's not like one person, has to go to residential treatment to get help and it be effective. It depends on the individual. And I wanted to also mention each individual has their own stigma and their own attitudes about their addictions.
Yes.
So that's
Yes.
another thing, right? So
That's a big thing.
so let's, say your attitude about addiction is that person should seek treatment in this certain, aspect or place. But that person might have their own stigma or attitude about that. So we must not allow our attitudes or beliefs to affect that person's attitudes or beliefs, right? To figure it out. Recovery of mental health, of trauma, of addiction is a journey. It takes time. Trauma takes time through help. And that help could be in many different aspects. We're very complicated. People in general, we're very unique, where we have complexities, and our needs are met in many different avenues and aspects, right? So, and learning what those are, because individually use maybe something to cope with, or living a life that was very closed off, potentially, and learning yourself, your identity, who you are again. It takes a lot of time and a lot of compassion, of kindness, and it could be in a lot of different, mediums of help. So I will pass it over to Cynthia.
Yeah. So as I kind of talk a little bit about House of Sovereignty and the programs that we have here, I'm not going to go into great detail because we have so many. It would take like a whole other webinar to kind of go through it. So I'm just going to give you a snapshot of it. But while I'm doing that, if there's anybody that's here today that's listening, that has a question, something that we haven't addressed, something that you really were hoping to maybe get some insight on, please start thinking about that and put it in the chat so that we can get to it when I finish kind of, going through this. Even if you don't have a question, if you want to make a comment about what you're taking away from this experience with you today, I would love to hear that as well. So at the House of Sovereignty, the number that you're going to see up here is our main number, and the extension 115 is to intake, and this is where you can be triaged to what it is that you're looking for. So we do have virtual treatment for all genders. So regardless of gender, if you're looking for a treatment experience and you can't get into a residential program, even though that's something that is really important to you, it doesn't mean you can't get evidence-based treatment that's really helpful, and that you can't start taking steps to work a recovery program prior to getting into residential treatment. This is what we call, pre-treatment, or just living in recovery. All you have to do is make a decision and take action on it. You don't have to wait to get accepted to a certain facility before you're allowed to address or identify as somebody who's decided to embark on a journey of recovery. so we have virtual treatment for all genders. Yes, it does require technology, and our workers here are trained to help you with the technology to a certain point, to make you have a successful experience. So we do have that. And in regards to the treatment that we have for men, I want you to know that this was something that we hadn't done before. This is something that we started doing because of COVID. And we really, really wanted to make treatment help available for not just the women we serve, but also for the men in our community or the men that are on addiction medicine that might be experiencing barriers or difficulties in getting into residential. We wanted something to be available. We don't want people having to feel like they are held hostage by their addiction and that they can't get help. Help is out there. It just might not begin looking like the way you wanted it to look like, but it doesn't mean that you can't take action. Obviously, we have residential for women, transitional care, which most people know as aftercare. So we do have those services. So even if you're from Windsor and you graduated from a program in another place in the province, you can still, the women can still come, here and reach out and access that transitional care. For the men, there's other transitional care for them, planning that we do with them. There's crisis counseling available. We have parenting and recovery programs. We have, if you are on probation, being released recently, or from custody, or you have charges pending, we have a worker that is specifically just for those who are justice involved, dealing with those issues. We have housing support. We have these recovery enhancement webinars. So if you don't like going out, or you're afraid to be in groups because of the COVID, every Tuesday night, all you have to do is call and say, I'm interested in the recovery webinars. My colleague that hosts those webinars picks recovery friendly topics, makes it fun, and just has a discussion with the participants that show up, just to keep people feeling motivated and moving in the right direction that promotes life affirming behavior and wellness and all of that good stuff. And then of course we have a robust family and friend support system, which I'll talk more about tomorrow, but that's available as well.
Awesome. So I'm just going to go over some of CMHA's resources, and then there are some in the chat. And I wanted to also add an additional resource to the chat for everyone from the Google Slides I mentioned before, Cynthia. So what I wanted to talk about real quick is Cmha Programs in Windsor-Essex. So we do have a concurrent program where an individual has mental health, doesn't necessarily have to have a diagnosis of concurrent mental health and addictions. When we talk about trauma, that's all mental health. When we talk about, any sort of, use of coping for, really anyone who would like to be have access to one-on-one with a worker in the community could contact the crisis center at 519-973-4435, and just look and say, I'm looking for this information about this program, and
Right.
you would be able to do it on the phone or go in to the crisis wellness center and do that. There's another mental health and addictions urgent care center that opened during the pandemic, during COVID, because we noticed that a lot of individuals, weren't going to the ER. It's like we wanted to, open another access point. So at 1400 Windsor Avenue, where CMHA is, anyone during the hours on, I believe it's Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays, 11:30 to 7:30, and then Wednesdays and Fridays is 8:30 to 4:30, can walk in and access someone who can, whether it's a social worker, whether it's psychiatrist or primary care, or addictions worker, if they're in an urgent care need of some sort. So like we talked about, what's an emergency? If you're having an emergency, obviously mental health emergency, whether that's suicidal harm or ideation, psychosis, a severe withdrawal, medical issues, please go to the ER. But if you're having an urgent care issue, mental health and addiction urgent care issue, you could come in to that center during those hours. Otherwise, the crisis mental wellness center is there as well. Or even if you have questions you want to go in and ask, please just call and feel free. Just because it's called the crisis number, the coordinated access line, that means anyone in the community can call. That is accessible by anyone. If you want to even just call and ask like what or experience what it's like, just call and and just see what it's like, because a lot of the time we're referring our friends or family to the crisis, and if they need help because it's 24 hours a day, but they don't know what to expect, right? So just knowing what that experience is like is important as well, I think.
I
And
love that you said that, Evelina. I love
yeah,
that you said that, because it's so true
yeah.
that some people won't even access because they're feeling anxious about what the experience is like. So it is completely reasonable and acceptable to call these places, that whether it be Canadian Mental Health or whether it be the House of Sophrosine, and say, I'm interested in maybe coming and accessing your service. Can you tell me a little bit about what the experience is like, or what I can expect, or what I should bring with me, or, and that can begin to ease some of the anxiety. But just start calling and reaching out, for sure.
Mhm,
I love that you
mhm.
mentioned that.
And if you're a friend or a family member of someone you'd like that for them to have these services, or these things available, call yourself and do that the same thing, and be like, hey, I want to just know what this is like, or I'm calling with that person at the same time. I'm with them, so I'm just here just
Yeah.
to, you know. And there is a friends and family group that runs once in a while as well. And I'm not going to get into for addictions, actually. I think it's in the evenings once in a while, but right now I don't think they're doing in-person groups, so it's all virtual as well. So similar to House of Socracy, there are services available. What's one, whatever road you want to take, it really doesn't matter, because one thing could work for one person, another thing will work for another person. But there are lots of programs available, and I just want you to know that there is a lot of help out there. So please, don't be shy. These are all free services, and if feel free, and I hope you have you understanding of all these resources and agencies available. The other community and online resources is, during the pandemic, the government of Canada started Wellness Together Canada. It's an online portal for mental health and substance use supports during COVID. Well, it's still going on right now. If you want to know what services are up to date and available, 211 or Connects Ontario. So calling 211 or checking the website, they always have up to date information. It's a great resource. And same with Connects Ontario, which I believe is part of like 211. So it's pretty confidential service information. So if you're not sure, you can always call them or check their website out. Cmha, which is the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, they have a mobile app even. So how to manage stress, anxiety, and it's all evidence-based. So if you want to have something on your phone that would be helpful, and easily accessible and free, you could always download that app. And Big White Wallet is a forum for peer support that is monitored by counselors. And so you just make an account, and I have safety rules. And if you can read about other people's experiences, you could provide feedback, and it's all safe because it's monitored. And you have to make an account that's anonymous, because if they have to remove the account, then they'll be able to do so. So it's not like a free for all kind of thing. But there's also
Mm.
modules on there: how to sleep, how to sleep better, reducing drinking even. There's stuff for anxiety, stuff for mood. They even have assessments and self checks and things.
Yep. They
So
have mini assessments. They have mini courses you can take on different
yeah,
mental health issues. Yeah, it's
yeah.
it's a very cool interface. Absolutely. Before we finish with our
Yeah.
self-compassion practice, I just wanted to say that, somebody had mentioned in the chat that they really did like the suggestion about inviting clients to get curious about their substance use and the way that it's impacting them. So I'm glad that you found that beneficial. Definitely use it. That this is what these things are for, is to share knowledge and to have an information exchange, to somehow benefit, the people that maybe be impacted by addiction and trauma. And I'm just wondering, Evelina, for people that might be watching this video on the recording, is there going to be your email listed if they too wanted a copy or a PDF of the slides? Is that an option for them?
Sure. Yeah, I could, or there'll be the MHP, the mental health promotion email, if they ask for a copy of the slides.
Okay. All
Yes.
right.
So
Okay.
I get both, so I can. I'll definitely share that email, mhp at cmha dash. It's such a long email. WCB. No one's gonna remember that, but yeah, I'll make sure that's in the comments. I'll make sure in the
Okay.
comments.
So what we're going to do to finish is I've sprinkled this word of compassion and not judgment throughout the webinar today, and it will be sprinkled again tomorrow. because to me, it is at the heart of what I feel we need when we're working with people, because you want to know the truth of it. The truth of it is, you can have the most evidence-based approach. You can have the highest level of education. If you don't have a compassionate, non-judgmental heart, all of that stuff is going to fall flat. And you may not actually reach or help the person because they don't feel that sincerity from you. People need to feel that it's safe enough to be real and to be honest about what they've been through. Because trauma inside of a person is afraid to be seen. And addiction feels so shameful at times that you don't want it to be seen. So this is why, for me, I'm always leading with this concept and this idea of having a compassionate, non-judgmental heart. And you can increase your compassion through education and understanding. And so it's worthwhile for you to invest in that and attend these kind of webinars and access family and friend services and stuff like that. So we're going to close with, just this. If you want to close your eyes, if you're uncomfortable closing your eyes, because people with a history of trauma, sometimes that is not a good experience, I would say find something that you could stare at and soften your gaze, okay? And I just want you to be still for a moment. And I want you to become curious about your breath. And I want you to allow your breath to fall into a natural rhythm that makes sense for you. Let your shoulders fall a little bit down into a relaxed state. And as I go through these statements, what I want you to do is to repeat after me in your mind. And we're going to start by offering ourselves compassion. And we're going to finish by offering the compassion we want for ourselves to others. So repeat after me. May I be safe. May I be healthy in body and in mind. May I be happy, truly happy. May I live my life with peace and ease. May you be safe. May you be healthy in body and in mind. May you be happy, truly happy. And may you live your life with peace and ease. And just take a breath and come back into your space. This is something simple that you can do in between clients, that you can do during a break, that you can do at home, that you can do riding a bus, that you could have it written somewhere. You could, if you start to feel overwhelmed or aggravated, it's very simple. Once you kind of know, what it is you want to say that's in the spirit of what's written here, there's no reason why you couldn't do this as a grounding, a centering technique, just to remind yourself of the flow and the direction that you want to be going in life.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And
You're welcome.
I just wanted to say thank you to you for co-facilitating today with me.
You're welcome.
You at so much wonderful feedback in the chat. Thanks for your wisdom and your knowledge and your perspective, and that was a wonderful practice and exercise. I really enjoyed that. I hope you all also enjoyed that.
Mm-hmm.
And this will be posted on Cmha's YouTube and our Facebook and everything like that. I think that's on here. The information is here. So please check that out in the next coming couple of days. We also have another webinar tomorrow at 10 a.m. for families, specific to families, and friends, those, affected by a loved one's addiction, right? So we hope you can join us for that too. It's tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure.
And thank you all. And Cynthia, anything left you wanted to mention before we close?
I really appreciate people that have come to support this webinar today. I very, very much appreciate it. And I'm really grateful for the people that interact or offer their feedback and their thoughts because, you know, one person doesn't know it all. That's the truth of it. And everybody has their own experiences, their own wisdom, everybody from professional to lived experience. And I want to hear, I enjoy having a meeting of the minds. I enjoy hearing people who have different experiences than me. I enjoy people who have different opinions and approaches than me. Because this is what, people are so diverse that thank goodness that we have diversity in the help that's available, because then the people have a better chance of linking and matching up with what resonates with them.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We're going to end for today, and thank you for joining us.